10 hours. That was all it took for Veronica Sloan to chain the gate, storm the driveway, and declare Nolan Mercer's own farm seized before he ever made it home. She stood in his yard with 8 security guards behind her, tearing down his signs and hauling his files into a truck, certain a lone rancher had no way to fight back. What she never knew was that Nolan had already sent the coordinates to one man, his oldest friend, a former Marine named Grant Hollis. Grant did not raise a fist when he arrived. He raised a hidden camera, a federal record, and one question that left Veronica with nowhere left to hide. Nolan was 42 years old, a former irrigation systems engineer who had left a stable career in Denver to take over Red Hollow Farm after his uncle passed away, inheriting not just 640 acres of land but a set of habits that had kept the place running for 3 generations. He was a quiet man by nature, more comfortable reading a soil report than arguing in public, and the people who knew him best described him as someone who watched everything twice before saying a word. Since the day he moved back to Montana, Nolan had made a habit of keeping every receipt, every map, and every email tied to the farm, a discipline that had once seemed almost excessive to the few visitors who noticed the filing cabinet's lining, his office wall. What none of them understood was that Nolan had learned slowly and sometimes painfully that a piece of paper filed away today could become the only thing standing between him and disaster tomorrow. The morning had started the way most mornings did on Red Hollow Farm, with Nolan awake before 6:15, walking the barn, checking the irrigation lines, and glancing at the 3 cameras his friend had mounted weeks earlier at the east gate, the equipment shed, and the dirt road that ran down toward the reservoir. For months, the letters from Silvercrest Homeowners Association had kept arriving, demanding that he tear down his wooden fence, repaint his barn in what they called community colors, pay a fee for use of an internal road, and allow an inspector onto his property to examine his water system. Nolan had answered every one of those letters in writing, explaining that Red Hollow Farm sat on an independent land title, recorded years before the subdivision around it had ever been built. Veronica kept sending invoices anyway until the total climbed past $38,400. A number Nolan understood was never really about money. What the association actually wanted was the narrow road running along the eastern edge of his 640 acres, the only route wide enough for construction equipment to reach the resort community Veronica intended to build. That morning, Nolan had to drive nearly 4 hours each way to deliver a load of cattle for inspection, a trip that would keep him away from the farm for almost exactly 10 hours. Before he left, Grant called to warn him that a gray sport utility vehicle had parked near the gate 2 nights running, and though Nolan assumed it was nothing more than someone scouting the property, Grant insisted he switch on remote monitoring for every camera before pulling out of the driveway. Nolan photographed the padlock, the electric meter, the fuel shed, and the ownership certificate hanging in his office, then sealed a survey map and an HOA exemption letter inside the safe, a habit that had always felt excessive until the day it would matter most. As Nolan's truck disappeared down the county road, a dark sedan parked half a mile away began to move, and the man behind the wheel placed a call to Veronica. At 7 minutes past 8 that morning, 3 vehicles marked with the Silvercrest emblem rolled to a stop outside Red Hollow Farm, and Veronica stepped out to examine the padlock on the gate with the satisfaction of someone who had planned this moment for weeks. She turned to the men beside her and said that by the time the owner returned, he would not recognize the place he called home. Veronica had not come alone. Beside her stood Everett Pike, the association's attorney, along with Marla Voss, who managed a private security crew of 6'2" locksmiths, a tow team, and a technician from the local power company. Veronica handed Marla a document titled Emergency Property Control Order, which claimed that Nolan owed years of unpaid dues, that his water system endangered the community supply, and that his fencing blocked an official evacuation route. When Marla asked whether the sheriff had approved any of this, Veronica assured her that Everett had already confirmed the association's right to protect itself, though Everett himself said nothing, his silence doing the work. His conscience would not allow his voice to do. The locksmiths cut through the gate's chain within minutes, and one of the security men climbed a ladder to spray paint across the lens of the main camera, while another yanked the power cable from a second unit near the shed. Neither of them noticed the small camera hidden inside an old electrical box near the fence line, a backup Grant had installed after noticing strange tire tracks weeks before, and that lens kept recording everything without interruption. Veronica's crew parked trucks to block the driveway, tore down the private property signs, sealed the equipment shed, taped a seizure notice to the front door, and moved Nolan's tractor to the far side of the yard, then planted a new private sign that read, Property Managed by Silvercrest Homeowners Association. Inside the house, the seizure crew moved with the same clinical efficiency they had shown outside, sorting through drawers in the kitchen, unplugging the router in the hallway, and stacking boxes of paperwork near the front door, as though the home itself were nothing more than inventory to be cataloged. A framed photograph of Nolan's uncle, the man who had built the barn with his own hands decades earlier, was taken down from the wall and set face down on the counter, a small detail that meant nothing to the crew carrying it out but would mean everything to Nolan when he finally saw the footage. Outside, the herding dogs paced along the fence line, barking at strangers they did not recognize until one of the security guards ordered them locked inside the barn to keep them out of the way. A contractor began measuring the eastern road just as Tessa Wren, the county surveyor, happened to be passing through on an unrelated job nearby. When she checked the freshly planted stakes against the official survey in her truck, she realized they had been placed nearly 90 feet off the true boundary line, and when Veronica pressed her to sign a document confirming the new markers, Tessa refused, choosing instead to quietly photograph every stake before driving away. Everett noticed something worse, only minutes later discovering his own signature on the seizure order despite never having drafted or approved it, and when he confronted Veronica, she brushed the concern aside as nothing more than an administrative copy, a phrase that did little to calm the unease. Now, settling over him, Veronica's real intention was smaller than an outright theft of the land, though no less damaging. She needed Nolan to sign over permanent use of the road access to the reservoir and a promise never to sue the association, and once she had his signature, the farm would technically be handed back to him, a hollow victory dressed up as generosity. On the hidden camera, her voice came through clearly as she told Everett that by nightfall, the owner would sign anything just to be allowed back inside his own house, a remark that would later become one of the most damning pieces of evidence against her. 200 miles away, Grant's phone had already begun buzzing with motion alerts from every device on the property. Grant had been inspecting equipment on another ranch when the first notification arrived, and pulling up the live feed, he watched strangers cutting through the gate, security vehicles blocking the road, and Veronica directing the operation, like a woman who had rehearsed every step. He tried calling Nolan first, but the signal near the inspection facility was too weak to connect, so instead of racing toward the farm himself, Grant relied on years of training that told him to observe before acting, recognizing in the number of vehicles and their careful placement along the road the unmistakable signature of a planned ambush rather than a spontaneous dispute. He backed up every second of footage to 3 separate storage locations before doing anything else, then called Tessa, who confirmed that the association had deliberately shifted its survey stakes and tried to pressure her into signing false documentation. Grant contacted the sheriff's office next, only to learn that Veronica had already phoned ahead, describing what she called a potentially volatile civil dispute, and framing Nolan himself as the unstable party, a narrative clearly designed to make any responding officer suspicious of the wrong man. He sent the department everything he had gathered so far, including footage of the locksmiths at work, a copy of the property's official boundary map, and the certificate proving the farm fell outside the association's jurisdiction, then kept digging through public records until he found something far more serious. Red Hollow Farm was protected under a state agricultural conservation agreement, meaning any alteration to its roads, water access, or boundaries required approval from a state regulatory office, a detail that transformed the morning events from a private quarrel into a potential violation of protected land. Grant's years in the Marine Corps had trained him to read a scene the way most people read a sentence, noticing not just what was happening, but what it implied about what would happen next. He had spent much of his enlistment working security and risk assessment details, learning that the individuals most dangerous in a tense situation were rarely the ones shouting the loudest, but the ones quietly building a narrative meant to control how the story would later be told. That instinct told him Veronica was not simply trying to seize a piece of land. She was constructing a version of events designed to survive scrutiny, which meant the only way to beat her was to build a version of events more accurate than hers and impossible to dispute. When Grant finally reached Nolan by phone, his instructions were short and deliberate. Stay away from the main gate, avoid arguing with anyone on the property, never let a hand touch another person, and switch on audio recording before arriving. Nolan wanted to drive straight home, but Grant asked him to stop first at a gas station 12 miles out, promising to meet him there before either of them went anywhere near the farm. A request rooted less in caution than in years spent watching how quickly a controlled situation could spiral once emotion took over. Years earlier, Nolan had helped Grant find steady work after his discharge from the Marine Corps, and Grant had never forgotten that Red Hollow was not simply Nolan's property, but the place that had helped him rebuild his own life after everything else had fallen apart, which was why he treated the coming confrontation less like a favor and more like a debt. Zooming into the footage one more time, Grant noticed a handheld camera in one security guard's grip, aimed steadily at the gate, as though waiting for something specific to happen, and the realization hit him at once. Veronica was not simply trying to remove Nolan from the property. She wanted footage of him losing his temper, footage that could be twisted into proof of an aggressive landowner rather than a man defending what belonged to him. At 4:42 that afternoon, Nolan and Grant met at the gas station exactly as planned, and Grant handed him a small camera, clipped discreetly to his shirt before checking that both of their phones were already recording. They drove in separate vehicles toward the farm, with Grant hanging back at a distance that let him watch the entire gate area, while Nolan approached alone, and as he drew closer, he saw the new lock on his fence, the missing private property sign. 8 strangers standing shoulder to shoulder, and a truck parked behind him in a way that made it impossible to simply turn around and leave. For a moment, Nolan simply sat behind the wheel, taking in the sight of his own driveway transformed into something unrecognizable, the evening light catching on the strangers' vests and the cold new chain wrapped around a gate he had opened by hand nearly every day for a decade. Something tightened in his chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the particular anger of watching people who had never lifted a shovel on that soil stand as though they owned every inch of it. Yet he forced his hands to stay loose on the wheel and his voice to stay level before he ever opened the door. Veronica walked out to meet him, carrying a folder of papers announcing that Red Hollow Farm was now under temporary management by the Homeowners Association. When Nolan asked to see an actual court order, she offered no such thing, instead pointing to the document bearing Everett's forged signature, while the attorney himself stood off to the side, unable to meet Nolan's eyes. Her terms were simple: sign over the road, pay the outstanding $38,400, waive any right to sue, and in exchange she would allow him to collect his personal belongings from inside his own home. An offer Nolan refused without hesitation. For a moment neither of them spoke. The only sound, the idle hum of engines and the distant bawl of cattle in the north pasture, and Veronica studied Nolan's face as though searching for the crack she had been promised would appear. When it did not come, she tried a softer approach, telling him this could all be over in 10 minutes if he simply signed, where she indicated, reminding him that his neighbors were watching and that resistance would only make him look unreasonable. Nolan answered that he had read every letter she sent him for months, and not one of them had ever come from a court, a fact that mattered more to him standing on his own land than any deadline she tried to invent. At Veronica's signal, 2 security guards stepped forward and ordered Nolan to leave what they called association-controlled property, though. When he asked exactly what authority permitted that order, Marla could only reread the same vague language from the folder without naming a single court or agency behind it. Nolan pointed out that the association had no power to seize land beyond its own boundaries, and when Veronica claimed a new map placed his farm inside those boundaries, he understood at once that the survey stakes had been deliberately falsified. A guard reached for his truck door, but Nolan simply locked it, kept both hands visible on the wheel, and refused to give anyone a reason to say he had resisted. Veronica raised her voice for the benefit of her own camera, declaring that Nolan was obstructing association personnel, then placed a call claiming he had tried to force his way into a restricted area. From a distance, Grant recorded every second of it, waiting until the tow team moved to hitch Nolan's truck, before finally stepping forward himself, dressed in nothing more than plain work clothes and carrying no weapon, no badge, and no raised voice. Veronica mocked him as the soldier friend Nolan had called in to intimidate her crew, but Grant only asked calmly and repeatedly who had signed the order, which court had issued it, who had authorized the locksmiths, and who had given permission to move private property, questions that no one on her team could answer with any confidence. Marla stood a few feet back through most of this exchange, arms crossed, watching her own crew grow visibly uncertain about orders that no longer sounded like anything she had been trained to enforce. She had taken the contract believing she was securing a piece of neglected land on behalf of a legitimate community board, not participating in what was beginning to look like the forced removal of a man from a home he legally owned. And the distance between those two realities was growing harder to ignore with every question Grant asked that Veronica could not answer. Grant gestured toward the old electrical box near the fence, where a small light on the hidden camera continued blinking steadily, and something in Veronica's expression shifted the moment she understood what that light meant. Sirens sounded faintly from the far end of the road, and Veronica smiled, certain the responding officers had come to arrest Nolan on her word alone. Grant only looked at her and said that she should hope they had come for nothing more than the call she had placed. 2 patrol cars arrived alongside Sheriff Alden Rourke, and Veronica moved quickly to intercept him, insisting that the association was enforcing an emergency order, that Nolan had threatened her staff, and that the former Marine standing nearby had been brought in specifically to intimidate her crew. When the sheriff asked whether Nolan was armed, he stepped out of his truck with both hands raised and answered plainly that he was not, while Grant handed over a tablet loaded with footage rather than arguing his case in words. The first clip showed the locksmiths cutting the chain while Nolan was still hours away. The second showed Veronica ordering a camera covered, and the third captured her, telling Everett that the owner would sign anything just to reach his own front door. Veronica insisted the footage had been edited, But when Sheriff Rourke turned to Everett and asked him directly whether the signature on the seizure order was his own, the attorney could only admit that it certainly resembled his handwriting, though he stopped short of confirming forgery outright. The sheriff, unwilling yet to treat the matter as anything beyond a civil dispute, asked both sides to keep their distance. A hesitation Veronica exploited immediately by claiming Nolan had violated the very order she had fabricated and demanding he be restrained on the spot. Nolan stayed composed, even as the humiliation of standing handcuffed on his own land pressed down on him, while Grant asked the sheriff to call the county records office directly and verify the order's case number, a number that, once checked, did not exist anywhere in the system. By now, a small cluster of residents from nearby properties had gathered along the road, drawn by the flashing lights, and the sight of a farmer standing with his hands raised on his own land, and their presence added a pressure Veronica had not planned for, since every version of her story now had witnesses who were not on her payroll. One neighbor recorded quietly on a handheld device of her own, murmuring to another that this did not look like any lawful eviction she had ever heard of, and the sheriff, aware that the moment was no longer contained to a handful of people who could be managed, grew visibly more careful in how he weighed each claim. Everett's hands trembled as he searched his email, and found a message in which Veronica had asked her assistant to pull a sample of his signature from an old contract evidence he would soon hand over willingly. Marla overheard the exchange, and asked Veronica outright whether her team had just spent the day enforcing a forged document, and when Veronica snapped at her to hold the line, Marla refused to lay a hand on Nolan for another second. Sheriff Rourke ordered every security guard to stand down, but Veronica pressed forward with one final claim, producing a newer map that placed the eastern road inside association territory until Tessa arrived with the county's official survey, and confirmed that the boundary had been shifted by nearly 90 feet. Veronica accused Tessa of favoring Nolan, but Grant pointed out that her coordinates had been officially stamped weeks before the dispute even began, and by then the sheriff had stopped viewing the day's events as a simple property disagreement. The most damaging discovery still waited inside a locked truck at the edge of the driveway. Grant's footage showed a security guard carrying a heavy filing safe out of Nolan's office and loading it directly into that vehicle, and when Sheriff Rourke ordered the truck opened, Veronica stepped in front of it and announced that no one had the right to search association property without a warrant. Nolan answered simply that the vehicle might belong to her, but everything inside it belonged to him. The sheriff held off on forcing the issue until he had firmer grounds, so Grant replayed the footage from the moment the safe left the office to the moment it was loaded into the truck footage, clear enough that Marla immediately identified the guard responsible as one of her own men. That guard admitted Veronica had told him the safe contained documents belonging to the association, a statement that only deepened suspicion once Veronica turned around and threatened to fire him for saying so. A reaction that convinced the sheriff she had something to hide rather than protect. When the truck was finally opened, it held Nolan's safe, the stolen private property sign, the cut remains of his original padlock, 2 boxes of tax records, and a router pulled from his camera system, along with a folder that had nothing to do with him at all. Nolan opened his own safe using the combination only he knew, finding his ownership certificate, boundary survey, conservation agreement, and water records exactly where he had left them. The unfamiliar folder turned out to belong to Veronica, and Grant quickly recognized it as a full development plan for what she called Silvercrest East, a proposal already advertising 86 new lots, despite the association never having secured legal access to the road required to build them. Investors had reportedly been promised that the route running through Red Hollow Farm would open within 30 days, a promise that could never be fulfilled without Nolan's land, which explained exactly why Veronica had needed his signature that same afternoon rather than any later date. Grant flipped through the folder page by page, and toward the back he found a glossy brochure meant for prospective buyers, complete with an artist's rendering of a paved entrance running directly through what was unmistakably Nolan's own pasture framed by trees that did not exist, and a welcome sign bearing a name the land had never worn. Sheriff Rourke studied the brochure for a long moment, then looked up at Veronica and asked how she had planned to explain a road through private property to a bank underwriting 86 new home loans, a question she did not answer. Everett finally admitted he had only been hired to draft a negotiation proposal, never a seizure order, and that his signature had been copied without his knowledge, a claim Veronica dismissed by blaming an assistant who had never been given such instructions. Grant asked the sheriff to preserve Veronica's phone, the association's computers, its internal email records, and every second of camera footage before anything could be altered. And it was at that moment Veronica quietly sent a message to a board member asking that the project folder be deleted. Grant saw the message appear on her screen and reported it immediately, prompting the sheriff to order her to set the phone down, an instruction she ignored until Marla stepped away from the group entirely and announced that her security team would no longer work on behalf of the association. What Veronica did not know was that Grant's camera system automatically mirrored its footage to a remote server managed by the farm's insurance provider whenever it detected signs of tampering, meaning nothing she deleted could actually disappear. A county investigator soon confirmed the association's email server had already been preserved under an emergency request, and buried inside the project folder was a single subject line that read in full the 10-hour campaign. Force Mercer to sign before dark. The investigator read through 3 weeks of internal messages, showing that Veronica had tracked Nolan's cattle delivery schedule closely enough to know the exact day he would be away from the farm for roughly 10 hours. Her plan had unfolded in 4 stages: move security onto the property while Nolan was gone, change the locks and remove anything useful from his office, wait for his return, and provoke a visible outburst on camera. Then use that footage to request a restraining order that would force him to accept the road agreement out of exhaustion. One email specifically instructed her staff to provoke Nolan without ever striking first in view of the main camera, a plan built entirely around a blind spot that never accounted for the hidden unit near the fence. Reading the messages aloud, the investigator noted a line in which Veronica had written that the owner of Red Hollow Farm was, in her words, too sentimental about a piece of dirt to fight back the way a real business would, a sentence that landed harder on Nolan than almost anything else that day. He said nothing in response, only looked toward the barn his uncle had built. And in that silence, Grant recognized something he had seen before in men who had been underestimated by people who mistook quiet for weakness. Everett read the messages bearing his forged signature and told the investigator he would cooperate fully going forward, a decision that visibly unsettled Veronica even as she continued insisting she had acted in the interest of the association's 214 homeowners. Nolan reminded her that none of those homeowners had ever voted on a plan to seize his farm, and when Grant requested the official meeting minutes, they showed no mention of Red Hollow Farm at all, confirming that Veronica had run the entire operation through a private message thread outside any formal board process. 2 board members arrived shortly afterward and confirmed under questioning that they had never approved a single step of what had happened that day. Veronica finally admitted the truth behind her urgency. The association had borrowed heavily against the expansion project, and without guaranteed access to the Eastern Road, the loan itself would be called in immediately. When Nolan asked why she never pursued a lawful negotiation, instead, she claimed he had rejected her initial offer outright, though Nolan clarified that he had only rejected a route cutting through his reservoir and protected wetland never, every possible agreement. Grant added that an alternate road bypassing the reservoir would have cost the association nearly $1,800,000 more to build, a price Veronica had chosen to avoid by attempting to take the land instead of admitting her original plan had been flawed from the start. Sheriff Rourke informed Veronica that she was now under investigation for trespassing, theft of property document, forgery, signature fraud, obstruction, and conspiracy to coerce a landowner, a list that made her attempt to simply walk away from the scene impossible. She turned toward Grant and accused him of orchestrating the entire confrontation out of some personal grudge against the association, to which he replied that he had created none of her actions, only ensured she could never rewrite them. As the sun dropped behind the fields, the sheriff asked her to place both hands forward, and before she was led away, Veronica turned back to Nolan with a final warning that he might win today, but tomorrow the entire neighborhood would take him to court. That warning proved partly true, though not in the way Veronica intended. Silvercrest held an emergency session and suspended her from the board, yet the association still faced the loan, its contractor agreements, and the very real threat of litigation from investors who had already put money into lots that might never be built. Several residents angry over what they believed would now be falling. Property values sent Nolan threatening letters of their own, prompting Grant to advise him against arguing publicly and instead releasing his evidence in a controlled, deliberate way through legal channels rather than emotion. The hearing itself drew a larger crowd than the small county courtroom usually saw, filled with a mix of Silvercrest residents anxious about their own investments, reporters from a regional paper following the unusual case of an association accused of seizing land outside its own boundaries, and a handful of neighboring farmers who had quietly dealt with their own disputes with the association over the years and had never before seen anyone push back with this much evidence behind them. Judge Rowan opened the proceedings by reminding everyone present that her only concern was the law as written, not the reputation of either party, a statement that did little to ease the tension in the room but set the tone for the methodical hearing that followed. Nolan hired a land use attorney and filed for a restraining order barring the association from his property, along with a request for the return of his belongings, compensation for damages, and preservation of every internal association record. Judge Celeste Rowan presided over the emergency hearing where the association's temporary counsel tried to argue that Veronica had acted entirely on her own, separate from any official association authority. Nolan's attorney answered that argument with the association's own vehicles, its own paid staff, its own budget, and its own signed security contract, all of it traceable directly back to funds the board itself had approved. Tessa testified about the falsified survey stakes. Everett testified about the forged signature bearing his name, and Marla confirmed that Veronica had referred to the entire operation privately as a takeover rather than an inspection. Grant presented his timeline of footage without exaggerating his own role, and when the judge asked why he had not simply intervened physically the moment he arrived, he explained that his goal had always been to protect Nolan rather than manufacture a second confrontation, understanding that chaos was exactly what Veronica needed the cameras to capture. Calm evidence gathered patiently had done more damage to her plan than any confrontation ever could have. The judge asked pointed questions of her own, pressing Everett on how long he had suspected his signature was being used without authorization, and pressing Marla on why her team had continued to follow instructions, even after doubts began to surface, questions that made clear the court intended to hold every participant accountable rather than treat Veronica as the only person responsible. Nolan sat through most of the hearing in silence, speaking only when directly questioned, and when the association's counsel suggested that his refusal to negotiate had forced the situation to escalate, he replied simply that a man cannot be blamed for declining to sign away his own property under threat, no matter how the property simply tuple threat is dressed up in paperwork. Veronica arrived with her own private attorney and claimed the board had turned her into a scapegoat for decisions everyone had quietly supported. But prosecutors produced a message in which she had personally ordered the deletion of internal files, undercutting her claim of innocence in an inequitable instant. Judge Rowan ruled that the association had committed a serious violation of Nolan's property rights and issued a temporary restraining order barring any further contact, a mandate to restore the gate and stolen property, a freeze on the entire Silvercrest East development, and an order for an independent financial audit of the association's accounts. Just as Nolan believed the ordeal was finally winding down, the audit uncovered that $620,000 had vanished from the project's funds, every transfer of it personally approved by Veronica. The auditors traced payments to a consulting firm controlled by someone close to her uncovered association money, spent tracking Nolan's movements before the seizure, revealed a high-risk loan clause that had been deliberately hidden from the board, and confirmed that a special assessment fee had been charged to residents without any legitimate vote ever taking place. The expansion project, it turned out, had relied not only on Nolan's stolen road but on inflated sales figures that never reflected genuine buyer interest, and once the bank suspended the loan and investors withdrew one after another, residents across Silvercrest began to understand that Nolan had never been the source of their crisis, only the man who had stopped it from growing worse. Word of the audit spread quickly through Silvercrest, and the same residents who had once sided instinctively with their association president now found themselves questioning every assessment fee they had paid over the past 2 years, every glossy newsletter promising rising property values, and every meeting where questions about the expansion project had been quietly redirected. Some longtime residents admitted in private conversations, later relayed back to Nolan, that they had always found Veronica's confidence, reassuring, mistaking certainty for competence, in a way that had left the board's oversight thinner than anyone realized until it was far too late. A group of neighbors eventually came to the farm to apologize, and rather than use the moment for satisfaction, Nolan agreed to attend a public meeting on the condition that Veronica be excluded, that every document be made available, and that any resident could ask a direct question. At that meeting, Grant offered a brief factual account of the timeline, while Nolan explained why the reservoir mattered so much, describing how it served the farm-protected surrounding wetland, and reduced fire risk in a way that could never be safely divided by a construction road. Tessa proposed an alternate route entirely outside Nolan's property, more expensive but fully legal and far less damaging to the surrounding land. A proposal the newly reformed board eventually accepted in place of adding further debt to a project already in ruins. Silvercrest sold off the undeveloped expansion parcels to cover its outstanding loan, and Veronica was formally charged based on the documents and digital evidence gathered throughout the investigation. Marla received partial immunity in exchange for her cooperation and her willingness to confirm exactly whose orders her team had been following, while Everett faced professional discipline for his prolonged silence, even though he had never personally forged anything himself. Nolan was awarded compensation for repairs, damages, legal costs, and a civil penalty tied directly to the association's deliberate trespass. And Red Hollow Farm was formally and permanently confirmed to sit outside the reach of any homeowners association, its gate rebuilt, and its private property. Sign returned to the exact spot where it had always belonged. At one point, Nolan asked Grant how he had been so certain the association's plan would ultimately fail, and Grant answered that Veronica had made the same mistake made by nearly everyone who mistakes authority for power. She had spent weeks preparing for how Nolan might react, yet never once prepared for the possibility that he simply would not react the way she needed him to. Later, Nolan handed Grant the old cut padlock as a quiet reminder of the day the farm had nearly been taken from him, and Grant studied it for a moment before answering that it had never been the lock that protected this place. It had been the evidence. 6 months later, Red Hollow Farm was running smoothly again, its eastern gate repaired, its barn restocked, its office reorganized, and its camera network fully restored. Nolan chose not to wall himself off from the world in response to what had happened, and instead invested in greater transparency, off-site footage, storage digitized land records, automated alerts, and a clear list of emergency contacts any neighbor could reach if trouble ever returned. Grant started a free monthly workshop for older farmers and independent landowners in the area, teaching them how to verify property boundaries, keep organized records, recognize fraudulent penalty notices, and handle conflict without ever stepping into the kind of trap that had nearly cost Nolan everything. And Nolan offered a corner of his equipment shed to serve as the workshop's permanent home. The first workshop session drew 11 landowners, several of them elderly, several of them managing property that had been in their families for generations, and all of them arriving with a version of the same worry Nolan had once carried: alone. Grant walked them through simple habits, photographing boundary markers twice a year, keeping digital copies of every deed and survey in more than one location, and recognizing the difference between a legitimate legal notice and a letter designed only to intimidate. By the third month, word of the workshop had spread well beyond Silver Crest, and landowners from 3 neighboring counties began making the drive to sit in the same equipment shed where Nolan's tractor had once been dragged away. Against his will, Tessa began leading sessions on reading survey maps and understanding land use rights, while the newly restructured Silver Crest Board adopted stricter rules requiring resident votes on any major project, banning any single president from signing security contracts alone, and mandating that financial records be published every quarter for anyone to review. The association itself was not dissolved, only rebuilt with real oversight, a distinction that mattered because the failure had never been the existence of the organization itself, but the unchecked power one person had been allowed to hold within it. Veronica's sentence included jail time, full restitution, and a permanent ban from ever holding a leadership position in any community organization again, and with the evidence entirely rooted in her own actions, she no longer had anyone left to blame. A separate investor later approached Nolan with a substantial offer to purchase rights to the Eastern Road, but he turned it down, unwilling to trade away the very thing he had just spent months protecting for the sake of a quick profit. Same mistake that had cost Veronica everything she once controlled. Standing at the newly rebuilt gate one afternoon, Nolan admitted to Grant that the moment he first saw strangers standing in his yard, every instinct in his body had wanted to drive straight through the barricade without a second thought. Grant told him that the very restraint he had shown in that moment was exactly what had kept him from walking straight into the trap that had been built for him. Nolan thanked Grant for ending the ambush, but Grant corrected him gently, insisting he had done nothing more than recognize the trap for what it was. It was Nolan who had refused to walk into it. The two men looked out toward the Eastern Road, where the false survey stakes had long since been pulled from the ground, and as the gate swung open, Nolan drove back onto his own land without needing anyone's permission at all. Some evenings Nolan still walked the Eastern Road alone after the work was finished past the spot where the false stakes had once stood past the fence line, where a hidden camera had quietly recorded the truth, while everyone assumed it had been silenced along with the rest. He thought more than once about how easily the entire outcome could have gone the other way had he answered anger with anger, instead of patience, had Grant not trusted his training over his instinct to rush in, had a single camera not been tucked inside an old electrical box that nobody thought to check. The farm looked much the same as it always had from a distance, cattle grazing along the same hills, the barn standing where his uncle had built it. Yet something in the way Nolan moved through it now carried the weight of a man who understood exactly how close he had come to losing it all. Red Hollow Farm had not been saved through forced threats or vengeance carried out in the heat of the moment. It had been saved through preparation, patience, and a friend who understood that the most important battle is sometimes the one where you never give your opponent the chance to make you look like the one at fault. Veronica had spent 10 hours building what she believed was a flawless ambush. Grant needed only a few minutes to prove that every step of that plan had already been recorded from the very beginning, and in the end, power alone could break a lock, tear down a sign, and surround a house. But once the truth stood protected by evidence, not even the most determined authority could claim ownership of something that had never truly belonged to it.